My name is Colin Alexander. I used to be the publisher of News of the North in Yellowknife, and now I live in retirement in the New Edinburgh area of Ottawa. I may not always get it right, but I was brought up with a strict understanding of the difference between right and wrong. It may seem naive in some circles, but I was taught to heed the saying attributed to the great philosopher of 2 centuries ago, Edmund Burke. All that is necessary for the forces of evil to triumph is for enough good men to do nothing. With this video, I'm doing something about the larcenous legal industry that scammed 50 grand in legal fees for a dispute where less than $1,000 was contested by each of 2 of us homeowners for the cost of replacing our common water and sewer pipes. Each year, the Financial Post magazine names an outstanding chief executive. Of course, by outstanding, they mean outstandingly good. I want to fill an obvious gap by heaping obloquy on an executive for being outstandingly bad. The playwright Bernard Shaw wrote that all professions are a conspiracy against the laity. But there must be a special place in hell for bad lawyers, bad arbitrators, and bad judges. On the legal principle of proportionality, and on the basis of evidence I set before you, the target of my obloquy is Tom McDougall, founder and the ultimate authority at the law firm of Purley Robertson's Hill and McDougall. In a manner of speaking, Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin said I should make this video and post my website, cowpat.ca. That is to say that in a libel action against the Ottawa Citizen, she said that the public has a vital interest in knowing about the wrongdoings of those entrusted with public duties by the state. A vital interest, she said. And with all lawyers, arbitrators and judges being officers of the court, I believe you may agree that what these wide boys did constitutes wrongdoing. But first, here's some background. When it comes to professional good faith dealing, it should not have to be said that society is entitled to expect all professionals to live by a superior code of ethics and by a duty to subordinate financial reward to social responsibility. We expect them to conduct themselves as members of a learned, disciplined, and honourable occupation. The head of any professional firm, therefore, should be a denizen of honesty and respectability, and he should establish a corresponding culture for all of his associates. Here's a shortened version of the Code of Conduct of the Manitoba Law Society, spelling out even superfluously my point for lawyers. The essence of professional responsibility is that the lawyer must act at all times with utmost good faith to the court, to the client, to other lawyers, and to members of the public. The lawyer who is incompetent brings discredit to the profession and may bring the administration of justice into disrepute. As well as damaging the lawyer's own reputation and practice, incompetence may also injure the lawyer's associates and dependents. A lawyer's conduct should reflect favourably on the legal profession, inspire confidence and respect of clients and of the community, and avoid even the appearance of impropriety. Fatuously, the Ontario Society's code says merely that its members may not knowingly misstate the law or cheat people. The lawyer can decide for himself what he does or does not consider dishonest or dishonourable. Ha, bloody ha. Ontario's deceitful apology for a code of professional conduct leaves out the basic principle that ignorance of the law is no excuse, let alone that there are objective rules for acceptable professional and personal behaviour. The so-called rules of civil procedure go another step further with respect to operations. They require lawyers to reach a just conclusion as quickly and cost-effectively as possible. Action is supposed to be proportionate to the complexity of the issues and the amount of money involved. Some time ago, I read in the Globe and Mail an obituary for a lawyer, of whom it was said how unusual he was. He was so adept at finding solutions even to the most challenging situations that he seldom had to go to court. Of course, usual in the law business is what makes the term honest lawyers a contradiction in terms. Its own sick joke. As one journalist friend says, who's been observing the horrors of law for decades, it's a henhouse business designed and run by foxes. And don't think judges are independent of the system, because they're not, or not at least until you've battled at least to the first level of appeal. Appointments and promotion depend on recommendations from within their cartel. For example, there's the case of Christina Finney. After her lawyer stole her money, she sued the Quebec Bar Association for failing to discipline a member they knew was a crook. At the trial of first instance, Judge Normand said the regulators stood above the law. Before the Supreme Court, all 14 law societies ganged up to defend their right to be incompetent and dishonest. Our highest court, to its credit, said, and I quote, "The concept of bad faith can and must be given a broader meaning that encompasses serious carelessness or recklessness." In case you think I exaggerate, here's what lawyer, author, and former law school dean Philip Slayton said in his book, Lawyers Gone Bad. Once he said, the practice of law meant giving good counsel about justice and fairness. But now it's a big business in which billable hours, take no prisoners victories, and the bottom line are the principal ends. Over-docketing is tolerated, if not encouraged, by firms that value profit above all else and set unrealistic billable goals for their partners and associates. Gripped by ambition, greed, and fear or panic, lawyers cheat, billing by the hour. Whether a lawyer is lying or not creates bad incentives and encourages unprofessional behavior. The longer it takes a lawyer to solve his client's problems, the greater his income. Despite his obvious credentials and authority, Slayton wrote that he holds little hope for real change to make the system efficient and even honest. In England and elsewhere, there has been one substantive and necessary change: the ending of self-regulation, because it was found so consistently untrustworthy. That's a change comparable with setting up the Special Investigations Unit to deal with complaints about the police in Ontario. That change is not perfect, but it sure beats having colleagues investigating themselves, as occurs with the Law Society and, worst of all, the ADR Institute of Ontario, or with judges being asked to rule against colleague equivalents. There are, of course, many honest lawyers, but they mostly keep their heads down. In the Advocates Society Journal, Wendy Matheson, now a judge of the Superior Court of Ontario, wrote of the different kinds of unsavory lawyers accepted and even admired by their colleagues, by the regulators, and by the lawyers' trade unions, and to a greater extent than you might expect, even by judges. Rambo lawyers, she wrote, are the "I am a litigator, I go to war" lawyers. The concept of professionalism does not come into their practice. A variation of the Rambo litigator is the litigator who has read only one line of the rules of professional conduct, the part that says you should be a zealous advocate for your client, and has thrown the rest of the rules in the garbage. These litigators do not understand that you can be a zealous and aggressive advocate without engaging in sharp practice. This brings me now to the business that set this video in motion. One of us 4 co-owners, Michael Dagg, was known by the children next door, as he told me himself, as the bogeyman. He got a fixed price quotation in writing from the contractor Bradley Kelly to replace our ruptured common water pipe. They also agreed to replace the sewer at cost, if that proved necessary. We only got a verbal on the sewer pipe, with the bogeyman saying we could trust Patrick Kelly because he was his friend. Dagg was to confirm in sworn testimony what the deal was, but Kelly charged $3,300 for $90 worth of sewer pipe requiring 2 man-hours for installation. The bogeyman paid the bill in full and then wanted the rest of us to pay him prorated shares of that overcharged bill. The following year, Kelly quoted just $1,000 to do a job for the bogeyman's personal benefit, for which Beaver Construction quoted $3,000. For our disagreement, someone like a retired plumber could have answered this question in a few moments. What was the deal, and how much was Kelly entitled to charge? But we were to end up spending $50,000 for arbitration induced over vehement protests by the law firm of Pearlie Robertsons and by arbitrator William L. Neville. I found out later that they had no right in law to impose arbitration in the first place. Shortly before this saga began, the Ontario Court of Appeal had confirmed case law dating from 1848 to the effect that the 1960 agreement to arbitrate they relied on does not carry forward to later owners of property. The point is that by definition in contract law, the two sides have to meet face to face to make a binding contract. This is not just first year law 101, it's first week law 101. Pearlie Robertsons and Neville acted as if they never even knew of Brian Casey's textbook, Arbitration Law of Canada, which sets out requirements for lawfully invoking a valid arbitration process. In the latest Financial Post magazine naming its outstandingly good CEO, there's a headline from an interview which says, "Great CEOs pay attention to culture." Culture is, of course, a function of leadership, and as President Truman famously said, the buck stops on the top executive's desk. In the war crimes business, the legal term is command responsibility. In government, it's ministerial responsibility. So I say that the buck stops with Tom McDougall. He may seem to be a denizen of the law and the wider community, but I nominate him as the outstandingly bad executive of the year for establishing a culture within which his Rambo operates. I nominate him especially for doing nothing when he was told, not once, but 4 times, about the doings of his rambunctious Rambo. On the firm's website, there's a lot of stuff about competence, stating the law correctly, and cost effectiveness. Evidently taking both credit and responsibility for what the firm does, McDougall says this on his own page, and I quote, "An organization's structural integrity comes from a strong foundation and a systemic commitment to organizational values and objectives. The dedication and passion of Pearlie Robertson's chairman emeritus and founding partner Thomas A. McDougall QC has been and continues to be central to the firm's structural integrity and its success." Of course, passion is the polar opposite of reason that's the foundation of law for everyone else. In any case, on the basis of evidence available to me, the firm lives by the values of make work and money grubbing, which Slayton says now is normality for big law. Here now are some of the most significant things that happened. Tom McDougall's Rambo wrote this to the 4 of us co-owners. He wrote, "The purpose of this letter is to invoke paragraph 6 of the co-tenancy agreement. If you do not respond, our arbitrator may hear the arbitration and make an award under Section 50 of the Arbitration Act, which can be enforced as if it were a judgment of the court." Right off, this letter makes the fraudulent assertion that arbitration was obligatory. As I just said, it's in all the textbooks on contract law, property law, and arbitration law, as well as the recent ruling in the Ontario Court of Appeal, that Pearlie Robertson's relied on an ostensible agreement that had no force in law, and which they were obliged to know that it had no force in law. Here's another quote from Tom McDougall's own webpage. "Tom's focus on and dedication to delivering the best informed advice to clients are hallmarks of the firm." See what I mean about command responsibility? In his own bureaucratic language, he says he and his firm have a commitment to providing correct information. That is, not to misstate the law. Rambo compounded his extraordinary misstatement of the law by saying that the bogeyman, his client, was entitled to sever our common water and sewer pipes and to make us install our own pipes direct to the city mains. This misstatement of the law overrides Easement Law 101. If what he said were true, which it is not, most of the older semis and row houses in Ottawa would be hostage to the lies and blackmail Rambo was laying on us. It gets worse. In his letter invoking the arbitration that he had no right to invoke, Rambo wrote, "Should you wish to participate in the arbitration, we suggest appointing a single mutually acceptable arbitrator." Having been led to believe the falsehood that arbitration was obligatory, I answered, "On the formal point of your letter, we, that is, my neighbour and I, are prepared in principle to accept the appointment of a mutually acceptable single arbitrator." Then followed the same day Rambo's acceptance of the acceptance. "Thank you for your prompt response. We recommend William L. Neville as the arbitrator. We will ask him to circulate his standard arbitration agreement if he is suitable to you. If you agree to proceed as we suggest, we will ask Mr. Neville to set up a mutually acceptable time for a pre-hearing conference. It ought to be a matter of common sense and common decency that a recommendation, by definition, is equally open to rejection or to acceptance. Not so in the Mad Hatter's world of Pearly Robertsons and Neville. Having been misled into believing that arbitration was obligatory, and having been dismayed by Rambo's insistence on who the arbitrator should be, I wanted to consider other candidates. But Rambo and Neville then collaborated to override our newfound agreement, as well as the strongest possible protests. They both reverted to the now superseded 1960 agreement, even if it had been valid in the first place, to say our only other option was to name an additional multi-$100 per hour person for their ridiculous tribunal. You may care to consider what Pearly Robertson's Neville did to secure the contract for arbitration in the context of criminal law as set out, for example, in Section 52 of Canada's Competition Act. No person shall, for the purpose of promoting directly or indirectly any business interest, by any means whatever, knowingly or recklessly, make a representation to the public that is false or misleading in any material respect. In law, the word reckless means in effect by incompetent oversight, regardless of actual knowledge or fraudulent intention. The theory of my business is that one's word is one's bond, and you should not even have to put a deal in writing, except maybe to remember what each of you said. Like anyone else, I may make mistakes, but that principle is solid. Rambo, however, was to write that there never was a deal on appointing a mutually acceptable single arbitrator, but only a suggestion. That word, of course, has a meaning quite different from what an accepted recommendation means. On this evidence, and bearing in mind that this is a cultural thing supported by management at Pearly Robertson's, I submit that the word of anyone in that firm, even when in writing, is no better than a junk bond, and maybe one that is completely worthless. It goes on getting worse. In shilling for Neville at the beginning, Rambo also wrote that Neville was, quote, conscious of the need to keep costs to a minimum, unquote. Neville then wrote to us to say, quote, I typically hold a pre-hearing conference with the parties to get a handle on the issues and the likely evidence that will be presented, so that using my experience, he says, we can keep the arbitration streamlined, fair, and cost-effective. Note those words, that fair and cost-effective. Ha, bloody ha. Neville started by demanding $4,500 in advance for his fees, and just the cost for the pre-hearing conference was to be $2,500, or more than the contested amount of money. In order to produce a decision, he said he needed a further hearing costing $7,500 just for his fees alone. Then you have to add on Pearly Robertson's fees running with their exorbitant makework at double or more than Neville's $400 hourly rate. Instead of his pre-hearing conference for the $2,000 disagreement, Neville could have done as much with a handful of short emails. In my own ever reasonable way, I suggested both to Pearlie Robertsons and to the bogeyman that we should address the issues between ourselves on the basis of the facts and the law, or that they should file in small claims court, where the filing fee is just $75. Taking the polar opposite approach of the man whose obituary I mentioned for dealing with disputes simply, Rambo wrote, and I quote, "Your letters on the subject of the matter of the dispute and suggesting alternative forums for this dispute are unwelcome." No wonder. There's no money involved in settling a dispute if you can go to litigation and trial. Given what Pearlie Robertsons and Neville said about the cost effectiveness of the arbitration they set in motion, and given even the minimum cost that would have entailed to reach a decision, the classic reasonable person may consider what they said in the context of bait and switch criminal law. That is, the representation of a reasonable cost of goods or services, and then the substitution of goods or services costing far more once the salesman has ensnared the victim. Here's just one example from so many of the wide boy's sharp practice. Responding to Rambo's offer to end the ordeal by process for the full amount of the contested claim, plus a usurious claim for costs, my widowed co-owner neighbour put their words into numbers. Then Rambo accepted her offer to pay the amount she had calculated. Next, I pointed out that she had included costs that she herself and the other homeowners had paid. When she asked to pay the correct amount of $1,000 less, Rambo held her to the higher amount. Cowed by the threat of ever-escalating costs, she paid 3 times what she would have paid under the other bidder's inclusive fixed price quotation for both parts of the job. The landmark case for exactly such a mistake in calculation is Webster versus Cecil, dating from 1861. In a more recent case, Hartog versus Collin and Shields, the judge lambasted the claimant unmercifully for his dishonesty. Even the bandit Jesse James didn't rip off widows and orphans. I submit that the classic reasonable person seems certain to agree with the senior Ottawa lawyer I consulted late in the process. He wrote that the way Neville came to be appointed as arbitrator was, and I quote, simply not right. And that we were, he said, and I quote, railroaded into the process. And there was, he said, a reasonable apprehension of bias, and that the cost of Neville's operation, quote, brings the entire administration of justice into disrepute. I submit that not only was there a reasonable apprehension of bias, but also that there was a reasonable apprehension of collusion between Rambo and Neville. I submit in the final analysis Tom McDougall himself is responsible for the outrages, of which I have just recounted just a small part, and that he personally deserves my nomination as outstandingly bad and unacceptable chief executive. Stephen Applebaum at the John Molson School of Business in Montreal commented on a somewhat similar situation in CBC's problem with Jean Gomeshi. When you're the manager, he says, you can do nothing and hope the problem goes away, but the real answer is to deal with it. That's the very thing Tom McDougall decided not to do. along with the other 50 stooges at the firm that I brought into the loop. I guess you can delude yourself into thinking you can avoid obloquy if, however stupidly, you feel sufficiently secure in your invincibility and your entitlement to entitlements. As a footnote, I submit for consideration by Chief Justice Beverley McLaughlin, Prime Minister Harper, and also the wider public that our justice system is so unsatisfactory that we need a public commission to inquire into its strategic and tactical... As a footnote, I submit for consideration by Chief Justice Beverley McLaughlin, Prime Minister Harper, and also the wider public that our justice system is so unsatisfactory that we need a public commission to inquire into its strategic and tactical inefficiencies in so many areas, as well as outright dishonesty in what should be an honourable profession. I submit that we can never expect the needed foundational change to come from lawyers and judges, few of whom have a clue about how to run any business, let alone a major institution. I will just add one more comment comprising its own black humour. Deputy Judge Marie Fortier presided over the trial for my action against Neville for fraud. After nearly 4 months of gestation, she produced what may be among the most irrational judgments ever to emerge from the Anglo-American justice system. As just one example of her scholarship, she quoted Lord Denning to rule that judicial immunity shields arbitrators totally. That is, even when they misstate the law to land a contract for their own services. But she left out Lord Denning's final sentence. It says that immunity applies only for the process of judicial decision-making. According to what I call Judge Fortier's innovative jurisprudence, arbitrators are the only business people in the entire world who are licensed to lie in order to make a sale. For more details about these shenanigans, including what I say about judges when I sued Neville for fraud, go to my website, cowpat.ca. There you will also find the lampoon verses I wrote about the wretched arbitrator Neville after I ended my action against him. I quit because of the judge's extortionary threats to award against me his tens of thousands of dollars in costs already incurred, plus whatever more was to come. But I only spent a couple of $100 before I quit. Ha, bloody ha. So now, and this time really in conclusion, I suggest any time you meet Tom McDougall, you don't just say, "How are you?" You say, "Hi Tom, how are you getting along with your obloquies?"